In December 1979, the war was finally over. For 14 years, white-ruled Rhodesia had fought a brutal guerrilla campaign against two liberation armies, ZANLA and ZIPRA, and lost. At Lancaster House in London, the warring parties had just signed an agreement that would turn Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. Guns were meant to fall silent. Soldiers were meant to go home. And the man most people expected to lead that new nation was not Robert Mugabe. It was Josiah Tongogara. Tongogara was the commander of ZANLA, the armed wing of Mugabe's own party, ZANU. He was a soldier through and through, a man who had built an army out of scattered guerrilla bands and turned it into a force capable of grinding the Rhodesian state to exhaustion. But he was also, strangely, a man with a personal thread connecting him to the enemy he had spent years fighting. Tongogara's family had once lived and worked on a farm near Solukwe, in the Midlands, as labourers. That farm belonged to the Smith family. The boy who grew up watching his parents serve the household of the local white farmer would, decades later, command the army trying to end white rule altogether. And the farmer's son was Ian Douglas Smith, the man who as Prime Minister had once declared that black rule would not come to Rhodesia for 1,000 years. Fate, or something like it, brought the two men face to face during the Lancaster House talks. According to accounts that later circulated, Tongogara approached Smith and reminded him of the connection. The same farm, the same childhood landscape, seen from opposite sides of the colour line. It was, by several tellings, a moment that startled Smith into a kind of grim respect. Tongogara reportedly told him that this war was never truly a personal quarrel between men. It was a fight against a system. He wanted a peaceful transition. He wanted room for whites to remain part of the country's future. He was, in the eyes of many who dealt with him, a pragmatist, someone the old Rhodesian establishment could at least imagine negotiating with in good faith. That reputation was exactly what made him dangerous to some of his own comrades. By the final weeks of 1979, Tongogara was arguably the most popular figure inside the liberation movement. He commanded the loyalty of thousands of ZANLA fighters who had endured the Bush War under his direct leadership. Unlike Mugabe, who had spent much of the war organizing politically from exile in Mozambique and had never held a rifle in anger, Tongogara had lived among the fighters, shared their risks, and built a personal authority that came from the barrel end of the struggle rather than from party congresses and committee rooms. Some observers, including officials inside the American government, saw him as a genuine rival to Mugabe for the leadership of independent Zimbabwe. A CIA intelligence briefing written just 2 days after his death described him bluntly as a potential political threat to Mugabe, citing his ambition, his popularity among the fighters, and his commanding style. That tension came to a head, at least according to later accounts, during the Lancaster House negotiations themselves. Tongogara is said to have confided to Smith that he felt his life was in danger, that his views on reconciliation were not shared by the more hardline elements around Mugabe, and that even while sitting safely in London, he did not feel safe at all. It was an extraordinary thing for a guerrilla commander to tell his former enemy. But by the time the ink on the Lancaster House agreement had dried and the delegations began heading home, Tongogara never got the chance to test whether his fears were justified. On December 26, 1979, while travelling by road in Mozambique near Chimoio, the vehicle Tongogara was riding in was reported to have collided with a truck. He died from his injuries. He was 39 years old. The official version of events, then and now, is that his death was a tragic accident, a car crash on a rough road, nothing more. One widely repeated account describes him dying in the arms of a fellow ZANLA official, letting out a final breath before going still. But almost nobody who was paying close attention in December 1979 accepted that explanation at face value. The timing alone was extraordinary. Tongogara died just days after the war officially ended, on the very cusp of the country's transition to independence, and only a matter of months before national elections that would decide who actually governed the new Zimbabwe. Had he lived, few doubted that Tongogara would have been a serious contender for power, whether inside ZANU's own structures or as a unifying figure capable of drawing support beyond the party's core base. His death cleared the way for a very different outcome. It removed the one man inside Mugabe's own movement with the military standing and popular following to challenge him for the top job. In the Zambian capital, Lusaka, where much of the liberation movement's diplomatic activity had been based, the reaction was immediate skepticism. American diplomats reported back to Washington that almost no one in the city believed Mugabe's account of an accidental death. When the news was passed to the Soviet ambassador, his response was reportedly instant. He called it an inside job. There were practical reasons, too, why so many people found the accident story hard to swallow. Tongogara was not a careless man traveling without protection. As ZANLA's commander, He moved with bodyguards and drivers who had kept him alive through years of Rhodesian air raids, cross-border ambushes, and the constant threat of betrayal from within the fractured nationalist movements. A man who had survived the entire war intact through some of the most dangerous guerrilla campaigning in southern Africa, dying in an ordinary road accident just as peace arrived struck many contemporaries as an almost absurd coincidence. Guerrilla wars breed a particular kind of superstition about survival and timing, and Tongogara's death violated it in a way that unsettled friend and enemy alike. Ian Smith was not a neutral observer of Zimbabwean politics. He had led the white minority government that fought a 14-year war against Mugabe's forces, and after independence he remained a bitter political opponent of the man who became Zimbabwe's president. Any claim Smith made about Mugabe deserves to be read with that history in mind. He had every motive to portray his old enemy in the worst possible light, and he did so, at length, in his own writing. Yet what makes Smith's account of Tongogara's death striking is not that he simply accused Mugabe of murder in the heat of political rhetoric. It is that Smith claimed to have gone looking for confirmation and said he received it from sources inside his own security establishment. In his 1997 memoir, The Great Betrayal, Smith wrote plainly that Tongogara had been killed by his own people, a phrase clearly aimed at Mugabe's ZANU leadership rather than at any Rhodesian, South African, or Mozambican actor. Smith went further than simply repeating the rumor. He wrote that he personally raised the question with Rhodesia's police commissioner and the head of the special branch, the internal security service that had spent years tracking the guerrilla movements and their internal politics. According to Smith, both men told him the same thing. Their assessment was that Tongogara had been assassinated. This detail matters for understanding why Smith believed what he believed. The Rhodesian special branch was, whatever else can be said about the apartheid-style state it served, a serious intelligence organization with deep sources inside the nationalist movements it had spent a decade and a half infiltrating and monitoring. If Smith's account is accurate, then his belief in an assassination was not simply the bitterness of a defeated colonial leader lashing out at his conqueror. It was, in his telling, an assessment passed to him by professional intelligence officers whose job had been to understand exactly this kind of internal power struggle. Smith tied this claim to the conversation he said he had personally had with Tongogara at Lancaster House, in which the general had described fearing for his safety from the radical wing of his own party. In Smith's narrative, the pieces fit together: a popular rival with independent standing among the fighters, a man who had confided his fears directly to his former enemy, and then a sudden death on a remote road just as the country stood on the threshold of a leadership contest Tongogara was well placed to win. It would be a mistake, though, to treat Smith's account as the final word on what actually happened, and reputable historians have generally resisted doing so. The evidence for an assassination remains circumstantial rather than conclusive. No credible investigation ever definitively proved that Tongogara's car crash was staged, and Mozambican roads in that period were genuinely dangerous, chewed up by years of war and poor maintenance, and there is no shortage of ordinary fatal accidents from that era to serve as a baseline. It is entirely possible that a well-connected, closely guarded senior commander simply died in a mundane road accident at an extraordinarily inconvenient moment. What can be said with more confidence is that the suspicion was never confined to Ian Smith or to Rhodesian security circles hostile to Mugabe. It ran through the diplomatic corps in Lusaka. It appeared in American intelligence assessments written within days of Tongogara's death. It was voiced, apparently without hesitation, by a Soviet ambassador who had no particular reason to defend Rhodesian propaganda and every reason to want Mugabe, a fellow Marxist-aligned leader, to succeed. Decades later, inside Zimbabwe itself, journalists and writers who dug into the affair found that the topic remained politically sensitive, with credible reports describing Mugabe's government moving to suppress a later book that investigated Tongogara's death. There is also a long, uncomfortable pattern that surrounds this single case. Zimbabwe's ruling party would go on, in the decades after independence, to develop a well-documented history of internal purges, mysterious deaths, and violent suppression of rivals within its own ranks, from the Gukurahundi massacres of the early 1980s to the treatment of internal party challenges decades later. Tongogara's death does not prove that pattern existed in 1979, but it sits at the very start of it, as the first prominent case in which a serious internal rival to Mugabe died suddenly, at a politically convenient moment, under circumstances that seasoned observers on multiple sides of the Cold War found difficult to accept as coincidence. Ian Smith, for his part, never claimed to have proof beyond what his own security chiefs told him. He was a partisan witness with obvious reasons to want history to remember Mugabe as a murderer rather than a liberator.